They thought a public humiliation at our 20th anniversary dinner would leave me broken. My wife handed me lockout papers from our real estate firm, laughing beside her younger lover and her complicit family. But she made one fatal mistake. She assumed I was powerless. She had no idea the massive international conglomerate she's begging to save her bankrupt empire is secretly owned by me. And tonight, I'm tearing her world apart. Make sure to watch until the very end to see how it all unfolds. If you love stories of deep vindication, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment below letting me know where in the world you're watching from. I absolutely love seeing where our audience tunes in from. Now, let's dive into the story. 20 years. If you want to know the exact measure of 2 decades, look at the crystal flutes raised in the ballroom of the Beaumont Hotel. Look at the way the light catches the champagne, masking the bitter dregs at the bottom. We had built an empire together, Evelyn and I, brick by brick, contract by contract, until our real estate firm dominated the city skyline. Tonight was supposed to be the culmination of that shared history, our 20th anniversary, surrounded by the elite social circle we had cultivated and the sycophantic family she had always insisted on keeping too close. I stood near the ice sculpture, nursing a single malt, watching her glide through the room in a gown that cost more than our first mortgage. The string quartet played something suitably sweeping. When Evelyn tapped her silver spoon against her glass, the room fell into a practiced, reverent silence. I took my place beside her, wearing the smile of a man who believed his legacy was secure. She reached for my hand, her grip unnervingly tight, and began speaking with that false, honeyed warmth she usually reserved for zoning board officials. She spoke of our early struggles, the late nights, the sacrifices. The crowd hummed with approval. Her mother dabbed at a dry eye. Then, the cadence of her voice shifted. The warmth evaporated, replaced by a surgical coldness. She motioned to an usher, who brought forward a heavy, velvet-lined anniversary gift box. She placed it in my hands with theatrical flourish. The crowd leaned in, expecting a bespoke watch or the keys to a European sports car. I lifted the lid. There was no watch. Resting on the silk lining was a thick stack of freshly stamped legal documents. I didn't need to read the fine print to recognize the immediate lockout papers, complete with an injunction stripping me of my executive access, my voting rights, and my physical presence at the firm I had built from nothing. Before I could even lower the box, Evelyn's voice rang out, echoing off the chandeliers. She announced to the silent room that corporate leadership required evolution, that I had become a stagnant relic of a bygone era, and that my termination as CEO was effective immediately. As if on cue, the mahogany doors at the back of the room swung open. She hadn't just fired me. She had already replaced me. She proudly introduced Julian, a man 15 years my junior with the predatory, polished smile of a corporate raider, as her new strategic partner and the incoming chief executive officer. The humiliation was engineered to be absolute. Her brother let out a low chuckle, a sound that rippled through her side of the family until it grew into a sickening, collective smattering of applause. They waited for my face to flush. They waited for me to scream, to break, to crumble under the sheer weight of a public execution. But as Julian took his place at Evelyn's side, their hands subtly brushing in front of 200 guests, I didn't give them the satisfaction of a single shattered nerve. I carefully closed the velvet box, tucked it under my arm, and offered my wife a slow, chillingly calm nod. They mistook my absolute silence for shock. They had absolutely no idea that the man they thought they were burying had already spent months digging their graves. The walk from the ballroom to the valet's stand was a masterclass in manufactured disgrace. 2 broad-shouldered security guards, men whose salaries I personally authorized, flanked me like a common trespasser. The murmurs of the city's elite trailed behind me, a venomous whisper network already dismantling my reputation. I surrendered my corporate key cards without a word, sliding into the leather seat of a waiting town car. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, the ambient noise of the city faded away, leaving only the quiet rhythm of my own pulse. I didn't reach for a drink. I didn't shatter the partition in a fit of rage. Instead, I opened my briefcase, powered on my encrypted laptop, and went to work. Evelyn was brilliant at the optics of power, but she possessed a fatal misunderstanding of how the foundation was actually poured. She believed that controlling the boardroom meant controlling the company. She never understood the architecture of the digital empire I had constructed beneath her very feet. Years ago, anticipating the inevitable vulnerabilities of corporate growth, I had engineered a shadow network, a series of encrypted backdoor servers operating entirely outside the firm's official infrastructure. It was a failsafe, a ghost in the machine known only to me. As the town car merged onto the slick midnight pavement of the expressway, my fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the firewalls Evelyn thought were impenetrable. What I found waiting in the server logs eclipsed the sting of any marital infidelity. Julian wasn't just a younger, sharper replacement in the bedroom or the boardroom. He was an apex parasite. Over the past 8 months, while Evelyn was supposedly scouting international markets, the two of them had been orchestrating a breathtakingly audacious corporate heist. Line by line, gigabyte by gigabyte, I watched the digital bleed. They were siphoning my life's work. The proprietary algorithms that predicted neighborhood gentrification, the automated valuation software that gave us a 10-year edge on every competitor, the ironclad contracts with our most lucrative generational clients, all that was being quietly cloned. I traced the outbound data streams, unspooling their tangled web of digital deceit. The assets weren't just being transferred. They were being laundered. The destination IP addresses led to a labyrinth of freshly incorporated offshore shell companies, registered in jurisdictions that thrived on absolute secrecy. Evelyn and Julian were systematically hollowing out the real estate firm we had built, leaving behind a rotting shell burdened with liabilities, while they packed the golden goose into an untraceable briefcase. They intended to bankrupt my legacy and launch their own untouchable empire, using my stolen genius as a cornerstone. Staring at the scrolling code illuminated in the dim cabin of the car, a chilling clarity washed over me. This wasn't merely a messy divorce or a hostile takeover. This was an assassination attempt. They had intended to leave me entirely ruined, a destitute footnote in my own history. I closed the laptop, a slow, predatory calm settling deep into my bones. Let them have the boardroom. Let them pop the champagne and toast to their hollow victory. They had no idea that they hadn't just robbed a businessman. They had picked the pocket of a ghost, and the haunting was about to begin. The transition from penthouses to purgatory had to look utterly convincing. Within 48 hours of the anniversary ambush, I relocated to the whispering fringes of the city, dragging a single scuffed suitcase into room 12 of the Pineside Motor Inn. It was a bleak, cinder-block purgatory where the neon vacancy sign flickered like a dying heartbeat, and the air hung heavy with the scent of damp wool, stale tobacco, and absolute defeat. To the outside observer, it was rock bottom, a desperate, pathetic refuge for a man whose life had just been violently dismantled. But appearances are the most useful weapons in a war of attrition. What Evelyn's private investigators, who I knew were parked across the cracked asphalt in a nondescript sedan, failed to uncover was the name on the property's deed. I didn't just rent room 12. I owned the entire peeling structure, the dilapidated parking lot, and the highly lucrative 40 acres of commercial zoning it sat upon, all buried securely beneath an untraceable subsidiary I had established a decade prior. It was the perfect hidden fortress for my masquerade. To win, I needed Evelyn to believe her victory was absolute. I needed her intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance, because nothing breeds fatal carelessness quite like unearned arrogance. So I embraced the role of the shattered exile. I let my stubble grow into a ragged beard. I wore wrinkled, unbuttoned shirts and walked with the slumped, defeated shoulders of a man crushed entirely under the weight of his own sudden irrelevance. The performance demanded a captive audience, and Evelyn's family was entirely too eager to oblige. Her brother, Marcus, arrived on a damp Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly to drop off a cheap cardboard box of my remaining trivial possessions. He stood in the doorway of room 12, refusing to step inside, his eyes sweeping over the stained carpet and the sagging mattress with naked, predatory delight. He offered a practiced, sympathetic sigh that couldn't quite mask his vicious smirk, loudly lamenting how quickly the mighty could fall when they lost their edge. I absorbed every single drop of his condescension. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the scuffed linoleum, nodding mutely, swallowing my pride and thanking him softly for making the trip. Word of my pathetic state traveled back to Evelyn's boardroom exactly as I had choreographed. I could picture her receiving the report, smiling over her morning espresso, finally exhaling the last breath of her lingering paranoia. By flawlessly playing the destitute, broken husk of a former executive, I handed her a false sense of absolute, untouchable security. She stopped looking over her shoulder. She stopped verifying the digital logs. Believing I was utterly destroyed, she and Julian accelerated their illicit timeline, stepping blindly off the edge of the cliff, never once realizing that the broken man rotting in the rundown motel was the one holding the rope. The moment the taillights of Marcus's sedan faded into the rain-slick highway, the posture of a broken man vanished from my shoulders. I locked the flimsy wooden door of room 12, drew the heavy blackout curtains, and went to work. The cheap imitation wood credenza didn't hold a television. It concealed a reinforced steel casing. My scuffed suitcase didn't contain wrinkled clothes. It held military-grade servers and a multi-monitor array. Within 20 minutes, the dingy, nicotine-stained motel room underwent a complete metamorphosis, transforming into a humming, heavily encrypted command center completely invisible to the outside world. It was time to wake the shadows. I reached for an untraceable burner phone and sent a single, encrypted alphanumeric sequence. By midnight, 3 black SUVs rolled silently into the abandoned rear parking lot motel. I opened the door for Elias, a forensic accountant who treated offshore banking structures like cheap jigsaw puzzles, and Vance, a private litigator so notoriously ruthless that opposing counsel usually settled the moment his name appeared on a docket. They didn't blink at the peeling wallpaper or the sagging ceiling. They merely unbuttoned their bespoke suits, opened their laptops, and plugged into my private network. We were not there to plan a standard lawsuit. We were there to engineer a slaughter. For the next 3 weeks, Room 12 became a windowless war room fueled by black coffee and cold calculation, while Evelyn and Julian sipped vintage champagne at charity galas, publicly celebrating their unchallenged brilliance. My team systematically dissected their entire criminal architecture. Elias tracked the digital footprints of my stolen algorithms with terrifying precision. They actually believed their Cayman Island proxies and Seychelles shell companies provided an impenetrable veil of anonymity. They were wrong. Elias peeled back the layers of dummy corporations, mapping every illicit wire transfer, every forged digital signature, and every encrypted packet of proprietary data. We documented multiple counts of corporate espionage, egregious wire fraud, and staggering grand larceny. The evidence wasn't just compelling, it was absolute. But Vance and I knew that simply taking this to the authorities would result in years of messy, drawn-out litigation. Evelyn was too well-connected, too skilled at manipulating a courtroom to play the sympathetic victim. We needed something faster, something infinitely more devastating. We began structuring an inescapable legal snare, a trap designed to use their own surging, greedy momentum against them. We didn't just want to prove they stole the firm's assets. We needed them to legally stake their entire lives, their reputations, and their personal wealth on those stolen assets. We drafted covert injunctions, prepared immediate asset freeze mandates, and secured airtight affidavits under the darkest cloaks of judicial confidentiality. Every document was a microscopic wire, in a tripwire they couldn't possibly see. They were gleefully constructing their new, glittering corporate empire, completely oblivious of the fact that they were building it directly over a massive, ticking fault line, and I was the one holding the detonator. Across town, far from the flickering neon of the Pineside Motor Inn, Evelyn and Julian were busy drowning themselves in the intoxicating illusion of total victory. To the public eye, they were the untouchable titans of modern real estate, a golden couple ascending to unprecedented heights. In reality, they were gutting the remaining cash reserves of my former firm with the reckless abandon of looters raiding a burning palace. There were whispered, envious rumors of a custom-built yacht moored in Monaco, staggering acquisitions of contemporary art, and endless, lavish nights spent drinking vintage champagne in penthouses paid for by the very foundations I laid. Evelyn wore her stolen crown with an icy, unbothered pride, entirely convinced she'd outsmarted the only man who had ever truly seen her. She mistook the absence of my retaliation for the permanence of her triumph. But beneath the glossy veneer of society pages and sycophantic press coverage, the structural integrity of their new empire was already buckling. Julian, for all his tailored suits and predatory boardroom charm, was not an architect. He was merely a thief. Stripped of my ongoing guidance and the nuanced intellect required to navigate the market, the proprietary algorithms they had stolen were severely mismanaged. Their offshore shadow company, the supposed crown jewel of the Betrayal, was hemorrhaging capital at a catastrophic, uncontrollable rate. Panic is a quiet, rotting disease, and it was rapidly infecting Julian's every calculation. Facing imminent, crushing bankruptcy, they opted for the most desperate maneuver in the corporate playbook, blinding their creditors with a glare of artificial wealth. They began funneling the absolute last of their liquid assets, millions of stolen dollars, into orchestrating a colossal, industry-defining press conference. It was a glittering, desperate mirage, a theatrical production designed to project invincibility while masking the terrifying, undeniable reality that they were violently drowning in their own incompetence. Salvation, they believed, lay in a singular, aggressive play. They needed a bailout wrapped in the respectable guise of a high-profile acquisition. Their sole target was Vanguard Omnicorp, a massive, faceless international conglomerate notorious for swallowing distressed assets and spinning them into pure gold. Evelyn and Julian threw every ounce of their remaining leverage at securing this merger, blinding themselves with the promise of a multi-billion-dollar parachute. This deal would legitimize their stolen empire, silence their whispers of insolvency, and absolve their catastrophic mismanagement. They courted Vanguard's anonymous executive board with frantic, sweat-soaked desperation, eagerly offering up equity, intellectual property, and operational control with both hands. They thought they were negotiating with a distant consortium of Swiss bankers and offshore magnates. They thought they had finally outrun the consequences of their betrayal, securing a permanent place among the financial elite. They were so utterly consumed by the blinding pursuit of their own survival that they never once paused to wonder whose invisible, calculating hands were actually pulling the strings of the monolithic conglomerate they were begging to save them. The rain continued to batter the frosted glass of room 12, but inside, the only illumination came from the icy, blue glow of my 6-monitor array. On the center screen, bearing the imposing, minimalist crest of Vanguard Omnicorp, the frantic merger proposals from Julian and Evelyn flashed in real time. They had absolutely no idea that the monolithic international conglomerate they were begging for a lifeline was entirely mine. Vanguard was the apex predator I had built in absolute secrecy over 2 decades, an offshore behemoth designed to hold the true weight of my wealth far away from Evelyn's grasping reach. Now, it was the very altar upon which she was preparing to sacrifice herself. I sat back in the cheap vinyl desk chair, savoring the bitter taste of black coffee, and watched the digital embodiment of their panic unfold. Their proposals were riddled with the unmistakable stench of desperation. They were offering absurd equity splits, incredibly aggressive timelines, and the complete surrender of board control, all wrapped in the polished, frantic vernacular of drowning executives. It was time to set the hook. Through a network of elite proxies, phantom corporate officers, and cryptographically secured digital signatures, I authorized my acquisition team in Geneva to open preliminary discussions. I never showed my face. I never spoke a single word on a conference call. I allowed my army of faceless, ruthlessly efficient lawyers to play the part of the eager, highly capitalized savior they so desperately needed. The bait was presented, and the waters violently churned. Evelyn and Julian struck it with blinding, reckless speed. They were so terrified of their own impending insolvency, so desperate to secure the Vanguard billions before their stolen shadow company violently imploded, that they abandoned every fundamental principle of corporate self-preservation. From the absolute silence of my motel room war center, I monitored the live feeds of the secure document portals as they began to rapidly strip themselves of their own armor. In their frantic rush to finalize the term sheets ahead of the massive, extravagant press conference they had already paid for, they voluntarily bypassed standard due diligence protocols. But that was merely the beginning of their fatal hubris. To secure the immediate bridge financing they required just to keep up their wealthy appearances for another week, Vanguard demanded brutal, uncompromising collateral. Without a moment of hesitation or legal scrutiny, Julian and Evelyn blindly signed away their leverage. I watched, my pulse steady and freezing cold, as their digital signatures finalized the ruthless addendums. They pledged their personal assets, the Monaco yacht, the contemporary art collections, the very penthouses they had purchased with my stolen funds. They enthusiastically waived their standard legal protections, binding themselves to aggressive, immediate forfeiture triggers if any intellectual property disputes ever arose. They were willingly wrapping the rough fiber of the rope around their own necks, pulling the knot tight with their own greedy manicure hands, utterly convinced they were securing a golden parachute. They didn't know the silk had already been replaced with an anvil. The eve of absolute destruction carries a very specific, suffocating silence. 24 hours before the grandest stage of her life, I imagined Evelyn was likely standing in the center of a cavernous, gilded ballroom, obsessing over the floral arrangements and the lighting cues for tomorrow's monumental press conference. She was preparing for a coronation, completely blind to the heavy, iron guillotine I had suspended directly above the throne. Here, in the suffocating gloom of the Pineside Motor Inn, there was no champagne, no frantic event coordinators, and no eager journalists. There was only the low, steady hum of the server racks and the cold, mathematical certainty of the trap waiting to snap shut. The illusion of my utter defeat required one final, masterful stroke of submission. Late that afternoon, a sleek black town car crunched over the gravel of the motel lot, horribly out of place against the backdrop of peeling paint and rusted sedans. A sharply dressed courier stepped out, carrying a pristine leather folder bearing the crest of Evelyn's aggressive new legal counsel. He knocked on my flimsy door with the hurried disdain of a man afraid of catching a disease. Inside the folder was a final divorce settlement. It was a masterpiece of unchecked arrogance and breathtaking greed. In exchange for a pitiful, insulting lump sum, barely enough to cover a single year's rent in this squalor, I was ordered to permanently forfeit any lingering claims to the company, the stolen intellectual property, and my own legacy. It was designed to be the ultimate humiliation, the final twist of the knife before she ascended to the untouchable billionaire class. She expected resistance. She expected pathetic, desperate phone calls of a broken man clinging to pathetic crumbs of his former life. Instead, I clicked my pen and signed the documents without a single second of hesitation. I initialed every draconian clause and punishing waiver with a perfectly steady hand. I handed the pristine folder back to the bewildered courier, offering a hollow, defeated sigh for him to report back to his employers. It was the cheapest investment I had ever made. By signing away a phantom empire, I fed her towering ego the absolute last drop of validation it needed to swell past the point of no return. Let her sleep tonight utterly convinced of her own omnipotence. As the courier's taillights vanished into the dusk, the masquerade officially ended. I turned back to the glowing monitors and authorized the final operational sequence. Across the city, and in boardrooms an ocean away, the Vanguard Armada silently mobilized. A formidable strike force of elite corporate litigators, ruthless forensic auditors, and private security contractors began converging on the city, booking the top floors of the hotels immediately surrounding the conference center. Subpoenas were time-stamped. Asset seizure warrants were loaded into briefcases. The board was set. The pieces were locked flawlessly into place. I stood alone in the dark, watching the city skyline bleed into the night, knowing that when the sun rose, I was going to tear her entire world apart. The grand solarium of the Apex Convention Center had been transformed into a glittering temple of modern corporate hubris. It was a staggering spectacle of wealth and unchecked influence, precisely the kind of extravagant coronation Evelyn had spent her entire life desperately clawing toward. The morning light poured through the vaulted glass ceilings, refracting off crystal champagne towers and the polished lenses of 100 waiting cameras. The city's financial elite, the venture capitalists, the real estate barons, and the sycophantic press, were packed shoulder to shoulder, murmuring with electric anticipation. They were there to witness the birth of a monolith. At the center of it all, standing beneath a massive, glowing digital banner displaying the Vanguard Omnicorp logo alongside their own stolen insignia, were Evelyn and Julian. They looked immaculate, glowing with the radioactive confidence of thieves who firmly believed they had just pulled off the perfect crime. Julian wore a bespoke suit that cost more than a luxury sedan, leaning into the podium with a predatory, practiced ease. Evelyn was a vision of absolute, unyielding triumph, her smile blinding as she addressed the sea of industry titans. She spoke eloquently of their shared vision, their unmatched brilliance, and the tireless innovation that led them to this monumental threshold. She painted a masterpiece of a narrative, weaving a story of a company that had shed its dead weight and evolved into an unstoppable force, ready to solidify its global empire through this historic merger. The audience hung on every word, applauding on cue, utterly mesmerized by the sheer audacity of her performance. I watched it all from the suffocating darkness of the wings, hidden just behind the heavy velvet drapes. My tailored charcoal suit, pulled from a secure storage vault the night before, felt like a second skin I had not worn in a lifetime. I listened to my ex-wife boast about the proprietary algorithms she could not comprehend and the client contracts she had stolen from my secure servers. I waited, perfectly still, as the applause crested and died away, giving way to a hushed, reverent silence. The moderator, a polished network anchor hired specifically for the occasion, stepped to the microphone. His voice echoed to the cavernous hall, commanding absolute attention. He announced that the final binding signatures were all that remained and introduced a moment the entire financial world had been waiting for. He called for the arrival of the anonymous, visionary chief executive officer of Vanguard Omnicorp to take the stage and seal the historic acquisition. The room held its collective breath. The heavy velvet curtains parted. I stepped out of the shadows. The crisp, rhythmic echo of my leather Oxfords against the polished mahogany stage cut through the absolute silence of the room. A ripple of confusion washed over the front rows, spreading like a virus as the elite crowd slowly recognized the face of the man who was supposed to be rotting in a dilapidated motel. I did not look at the cameras. I did not look at the bewildered crowd. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the sudden, terrifying pallor violently draining from my ex-wife's face as I walked directly up to the podium. The distance from the wings to the center podium was perhaps 20 paces, but in that span of time, I watched Evelyn's entire reality fracture and collapse. The radiant, triumphant glow violently drained from her cheeks, leaving behind an ashen, hollow mass of absolute terror. Beside her, Julian's predatory smirk dissolved into a slack-jawed tremor, his perfectly tailored shoulders suddenly collapsing inward as if the atmospheric pressure in the room had instantly multiplied. In the front row, Evelyn's sycophantic family, her brother Marcus, who had sneered at my motel door, and her mother, who had clapped at my termination, sat paralyzed in stunned, breathless silence. The grand, cavernous hall, packed with the city's financial titans, grew so terrifyingly quiet you could hear the subtle hum of the camera lenses zooming in. I reached the podium. I did not offer a polite greeting. I did not smile. I simply adjusted the microphone, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch until it was nearly unbearable. Then, in a voice as calm and surgical as a blade, I introduced myself not as the broken man she had discarded, but as the founder, majority shareholder, and acting CEO of Vanguard Omnicorp. A collective gasp rippled to the hundreds of attendees, but I did not pause to let them recover. I systematically dismantled her glittering fiction, piece by piece, live on camera. I spoke of a breathtaking corporate heist masked as a strategic evolution. I detailed, with flawless precision, the offshore shell companies registered in the Seychelles, the illicit wire transfers, and the exact proprietary algorithms they had stolen from my secure servers to build their fraudulent empire. Evelyn reached out to grab Julian's arm, but he physically recoiled, stepping away from her as if she were made of fire. The audience, the press, the investors, they were no longer watching coronation. They were witnessing an absolute slaughter. I exposed their desperate, hemorrhaging cash flow, laying bare the undeniable reality that the company they were attempting to merge today was less than 48 hours away from catastrophic bankruptcy. Then, I turned my gaze directly to my ex-wife. I informed her and the watching world that Vanguard Omnicorp formally rejected the proposed merger. I watched her eyes widen with a desperate, animal panic as I calmly explained the fatal addendum she and Julian had so eagerly signed to secure bridge financing. Without raising my voice, I triggered the immediate, aggressive forfeiture clauses. In front of the flashing cameras and the city's elite, I executed the legal mechanism that instantly absorbed every stolen asset, every real estate holding, every drop of liquid capital, and the very penthouse she had slept in the night before. I did not gloat. I simply stood at the pinnacle of my own monolithic empire and legally erased her from existence, taking back exactly what was mine, right down to the very last cent. The fallout was instantaneous and absolute. Chaos erupted in the grand solarium the moment I stepped away from the microphone. The polite, measured applause of the financial elite was instantly replaced by the frantic shouting of journalists and the blinding, strobe-like flashes of camera lenses capturing the exact second a false empire violently collapsed. Julian didn't even glance in her direction. The man who had promised her the world was already sprinting toward the nearest service exit, his face pale with terror, frantically dialing his own defense attorneys. He abandoned her to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. In the front row, Evelyn's family remained frozen in their seats. Their sycophantic smirks melted into masks of profound, nauseating dread. Marcus and her mother sat paralyzed amidst the wreckage, suddenly realizing their social standing and luxurious lives they had endlessly leached off my stolen assets were completely eradicated. They were ruined, destined to become nothing more than pathetic cautionary tales in the city's high society gossip columns by nightfall. As the frantic crowd rapidly thinned, executives and investors scattering to desperately distance themselves from the radioactive blast radius of her fraud, the cavernous hall began to feel suffocatingly hollow. Evelyn stepped down from the stage, her legs trembling violently. The immaculate, untouchable veneer of the visionary CEO was entirely shattered. Stripped of her stolen wealth, her cowardly lover, and her fabricated legacy, she was finally forced to confront the man she had so casually attempted to destroy. She approached the base of the podium, mascara running in dark tracks down her pale cheeks, her hands shaking as she reached out toward me. She begged. She pleaded for a fraction of mercy, whispering frantic, desperate apologies, offering pathetic compromises over assets she no longer legally owned. I did not raise my voice to interrupt her. I did not offer her the comfort of my anger, nor did I grant her the satisfaction of my forgiveness. I simply looked down at her. I offered her nothing but a cold, brutally dismissive stare, a silence so absolute, so suffocatingly heavy, that it crushed whatever fragile, remaining hope she was desperately clinging to. She was entirely a stranger to me now, a pathetic echo of a past I had already permanently buried. Without a single word, I turned my back on her. The crisp, rhythmic echo of my leather Oxfords returned to mahogany stage, measuring the physical distance between her weeping on the polished floor and the heavy doors of the exit. I stepped out into the crisp, blinding sunlight of the afternoon, leaving her entirely alone in the empty, echoing hall of her own ruined ambitions. A sleek, armored town car was already waiting at the curb, the heavy door held open by a silent driver. I slid into the deep leather seat, the door closing with a solid, definitive thud that permanently severed my connection to her existence. As the car merged seamlessly into the pulsing arteries of the city, carrying me back to my true life of massive, quiet power, I looked out the tinted window with absolute clarity. Betrayal is a heavy burden, but ultimate vindication is profoundly light. If you have ever been underestimated, if you have ever been forced to quietly rebuild your strength in the shadows, while those who wronged you stood proudly in the sun, then you know exactly how this victory feels. Stand firm in your truth, know your absolute worth, and never let anyone else dictate your final chapter. If this story resonated with your own journey, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives of justice, and share this video with anyone who needs a stark reminder that the quietest patience always delivers the loudest checkmate.